All right, go ahead.
Good evening. Tonight's program is brought to you by the Programs and Lectures Committee of the Explorers Club. The Explorers Club is an international multidisciplinary professional society dedicated to the advancement of field research and the ideal that it is vital to preserve the instinct to explore. Since its inception in 1904, the club has served as a meeting point and unifying force for explorers and scientists worldwide. Tonight, thanks are owed to Ann Passer, Chair of the Programs and Lectures Committee, Dina Weibel, and Kevin Murphy. Without their dedication and hard work, this service and this series and so many others would not be taking place. I am your host this evening, Dr. Jonathan Leader, fellow National Explorers Club, the state archaeologist for South Carolina, located in the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, and a consulting forensic archaeological recovery specialist with federal, state, and local law enforcement. The Tulsa Race Massacre has figured in many of my lectures to students in courses dealing with anthropology of law and conflict. When I first heard of the work by Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield and Dr. Scott Ellsworth, I was extremely pleased this important moment in history was being investigated by demonstrably the best possible team. Dr. Phoebe Regina Stubblefield is a well-known forensic anthropologist and the interim director of the C.A. Pound Human Identification Laboratory, located at the University of Florida, Gainesville. Forensic anthropologists go well beyond the normal bounds of physical or biological anthropology and have specialist knowledge applying the tools and techniques of physical anthropology to legal cases, usually with a focus on the human skeleton. Dr. Stubblefield uses the techniques of physical anthropology to analyze skeletal, badly decomposed, or otherwise unidentified human remains to solve crimes. This is precisely the tool set and expertise necessary for the investigation of the victims of the 1921 Race Massacre. Dr. Stubblefield first began researching the Tulsa Race Massacre in the late 1990s, after historian Dr. Scott Ellsworth invited her to help the Tulsa Riot Commission by conducting skeletal analysis for the commission's investigation. Her unflagging commitment to a stronger interdisciplinary focus to research has improved the C.A. Pound Human Identification Laboratory, advanced the Tulsa, Oklahoma Race Massacre Project, and will be clearly in evidence as this evening progresses. If you have questions, please place them in the chat box. I cannot guarantee that every question will be addressed. We will get to many of them as the evening goes on. Without further ado, I turn the presentation over to Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield. Dr. Stubblefield.
Good evening, everyone, and all of those out there watching. Thank you very much for your attention this evening and your presence and contributions through the chat box. I'd like to start by introducing my colleague, Scott Ellsworth. He's the historian on our project, and I have to thank him for calling me a few months ago. Well, actually, I guess it's a year now, and saying, am I still on board? Because for me, this journey started 20 years ago, but for Scott, it was considerably longer. And I'm very grateful that we're still on the team. So I'm just going to add a plug for his book because I'm shameless. So those of you who read Altitude Stories, hint, hint, but I will surrender the floor to my colleague, Scott Ellsworth.
Thank you so much, y'all. It's really great to be with you tonight. I'm going to try to cram about 100 years of history into 10 or 15 minutes. So needless to say, there's a lot of nuances going to be lost. I want to tell you very briefly an account of the Race Massacre, move on to sort of its legacy later on, and talk about what have been twin efforts to discover and uncover the unmarked graves of its victims. So the Race Massacre happens in 1921 in Tulsa. Tulsa is a boom town. It's an oil town. In the year 1900, it was a dusty cowboy town, a few hundred people living there. By 1920, it's a town where you have 25-story skyscrapers, you have electric trolley cars, you've got fine neighborhoods, banks, you name it. pouring into this boom city. And there was a lot of money. The money comes through oil. It was the oil capital of the world for a while. And as Tulsa boomed and grew, so did Black Tulsa. Again, about 100,000 people in the city, 10% or 10,000 are African Americans. They lived in a segregated neighborhood called Greenwood, named after Greenwood, Mississippi, where many Mississippians had come to Tulsa to live. And as Tulsa itself blossomed, so did Greenwood. They had a very active and vibrant commercial district. In this African American community, you had 35 restaurants, 20 grocery stores. You had 12 physicians and surgeons, photography studios. There was a hospital, schools, all of that. So this is going on. But as Greenwood is flourishing, it's flourishing in this era of worsening and very bad race relations in the United States. These years in the early 20th century and around World War I, this is the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, nationwide. This is the time of birth of a nation. This is the time when scientific racism is taught in all of the nation's, white universities, the Ivy League here at the University of Michigan and whatnot. This is also an era of what was then known as race riots. And what everyone understood these to be was some sort of a racial incident between blacks and whites blossoms into a larger fight where whites invade African American communities, attack African Americans, loot businesses, burn homes, things like that. That's what they were known as. This is also an era, though, when lynching is still prevalent. And the number of lynchings are becoming more and more barbaric. You're having African Americans castrated, tortured, burned at the stake, thousands of whites coming to these events and whatnot. And nothing drove white people more crazy, not just in the South either, but around the country, than an accusation that a black man attempted to rape a white woman. When that happened, the victim is not only lynched, they're often tortured beforehand. And we had such an accusation in Tulsa on Monday, May 30th, 1921. It involved a young African-American shoe shiner and a white female elevator operator. Something happens in this elevator. We don't know what happened. We think nothing happened. But the next day, the Tulsa Tribune, which was the city's afternoon white newspaper, portrayed this event as clearly an interracial rape attempt, that this young man, Dick Rowland, had attempted to rape this poor, orphan girl, white orphan girl, who's, running the elevator. And they also had an editorial entitled "To Lynch Negro Tonight," which was a way to inform the white population there was going to be a lynching in town. Well, the newspaper hits the streets, lynch talk runs rife, and a crowd of whites gathers outside the courthouse where this young African-American Dick Rowland is held. As the evening goes on, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 whites. At one point, they go home and arm themselves. They're now armed. They're prepared to rush the jail, but they haven't done it yet. Then at around 9 o'clock, 75 African-American World War I vets, some of whom are dressed in their World War I uniforms, go down to the courthouse to prevent the lynching. They present themselves to the white sheriff, who at this point is keeping the crowd at bay, said, if there's anything you would like us to do, we're here to help you, keep the courthouse from being stormed. The sheriff tells them to get out of here. As they're leaving, an elderly white man approaches a tall black vet, says, where are you going with that gun, N-word? The vet says, I'm going to use it if I need to. Oh, hell, you're not. A struggle goes off, a shot goes off, and the worst incident of racial violence in American history begins at that point. The anger of the white mob now is they're not directed at the young man accused in the courthouse. They're now out to get any African Americans they can. There's a gunfight that erupts at the courthouse that is sort of a retreating battle by the black vets back to Greenwood. Throughout the evening, the nighttime hours, white police show up. They deputize members of the lynch mob. They give them guns and they give them special deputy badges and tell them to get a gun and go get a black person. And you have innocent blacks who are murdered downtown. There are drive-by shootings in black residential neighborhoods by whites in cars shooting into houses on either side. A few fires are set, but it's really at dawn on June 1st The white community has organized itself over the night. They've gathered by the thousands on the perimeter of the black community. There's a whistle that goes off shortly after dawn, and whites move en masse. And what happens is it's a process. There are African Americans who are fleeing. There are others who are fighting back. Any of those who resist or fight back are eventually killed. There's a lot of hot firefights that go on. But basically, whites will come to, house by house, building by building. If there's anyone in there who resists, they're killed. Otherwise, they're taken away, led away, under force of arms to various internment centers around the city. The police also aid in this process, keeping African Americans in Tulsa from defending their neighborhood. And then what happens is whites will break into buildings and houses, loot them, and then they'll set them on fire. And this goes block by block. So by the end of the day on June 1st, when state troops arrived from Oklahoma City to quell the violence, Greenwood is gone. You had more than 1,000 African-American homes and businesses, including movie theaters and hotels and grocery stores and restaurants, have all been looted and put to the torch. More than 35 square blocks have been completely burned down. The entire African-American population, 10,000 people, are homeless, and an unknown number of people are dead. To this day, we don't know how many people died, whites as well as blacks. I think reasonable estimates go from somewhere in the 50s to maybe as high as 300. Okay, I'm going to skip a lot of what happens after the riot, but I'm going to move on to the fact that what happens afterwards is that the white city fathers and business leaders and political leaders in Tulsa decide that we're going to bury the evidence and we're going to suppress this story. Photographs of the riot are confiscated by the police and taken away. Official records are taken, never to be found again. Tulsa's white daily newspapers will not mention the riot for more than 50 years. There's this curtain of silence that comes down over this event, and there's nuances to it. Now, there are those who try to fight back against this, to bring up the story, to tell the story of it. There was a young sociology professor at the University of Tulsa, which was an all-white school in 1948, who heard about the riot. She mentions it to her young all-white Tulsan students. They say, "No, you're crazy. Nothing like that had ever happened." I mean, even 27 years later, the knowledge of the riot is disappearing. She ends up bringing a riot survivor, an African-American, to her class. And afterwards, her dean tells her that if she does this again, she's going to lose her job. As late as the winter of 1970, 1971, a white researcher, a conservative white researcher, wanting to write about the event, had his life threatened, both on the streets, at his home. He goes out to his car one day. There's a note on the windshield: "You better look under the hood next time," meaning we're going to put a stick of dynamite under your car next time. He moved his wife and young son out of their home. So what happens is that there are generations of white Tulsans who have never heard about this event. It's not taught. It's not talked about. They just hear rumors. And I'm one of those white Tulsans. So I'm 66 years old. My family history goes back to the 30s in Tulsa, but not to the 20s. When I'm growing up in town in the 60s, I hear rumors that there was a riot, bodies floating down the Arkansas River, machine guns, airplanes, and all of that, but you couldn't really find out anything about it. Then when I'm an undergraduate at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, I'm a history major. I need to write an undergraduate thesis. I decide I'm going to write about the Tulsa Race Riot. And I go back home and I begin this process there 45 years ago. I ended up writing a thesis. I was fortunate in that I ran into some African-American riot survivors who were adults during the time of the riot, who took a chance on me and told me their stories. And I was able to help preserve the history of what happened. At a graduate student at Duke, I went back, did more work. Then in 1982, I published the first history of the riot, a book called Death in the Promised Land. The book has been in print now for 38 years. And it helped to kind of crack it open a little bit, but it's really not until 13 years later, when a series of events happens in 1995. There's a long story. It begins with the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City that eventually leads to attention being given to the riot. There is a state commission known popularly as the Tulsa Race Riot Commission is created. It was the brainchild of an African-American state legislator from Tulsa named Don Ross. His plan was to create the commission to win reparations for riot survivors. All right, but there was also going to be a scholarly aspect to this commission. I was asked to be the lead scholar. I said, sure, I'm happy to do it. But it became clear to me when I joined that there was a feeling amongst the commissioners that there were a lot of records out there and we were going to go find them. I didn't think we were going to find them because I'd tried awfully hard to find them for years. So I thought, well, what can I do to contribute something to the knowledge of the riot? Plus, for the first time ever, we had sort of official backing. And I decided that the key question I thought that I could research was how many people died, and then also to find these alleged mass graves of riot victims, these unmarked graves. So I first went to the survivor community, men and women that I had known for more than 25 years. And I said, would you like me to do this, to start this search? And to a woman and a man, they all said, yes, please do that. I then went to the Riot Commission, asked them if I could do this. They were like, sure, go away, do your study. We don't care. We have other things. But then I was trying to figure out how to research this thing. I'm a trained historian, but deaths and whatnot, I'm trying to think of coroners. What kind of reports do I need to go? I knew a former Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation officer, a lawman, and who had become a documentary filmmaker named Mike Wilkerson. I called Mike up and I said, look, I'm going to try to do this. I need some help on what kind of records I should be searching for that I haven't thought about. And he says, well, have you talked to Clyde Snow? And I said, who the hell's Clyde Snow? And Clyde Snow, of course, is at that point the world's most renowned forensic anthropologist. He had identified Mengele, Dr. Mengele's, the Auschwitz Doctor of Death's bones in Brazil, had found the first graves that had disappeared in Argentina, had trained teams all around the world in El Salvador, Guatemala, Kosovo, you name it, the Congo, in terms of searching for mass graves. He lives in Oklahoma. Of course, he wasn't home. I tracked him down at a hotel in Guatemala City, got him on the line. Hi, Clyde, this is Scott Ellsworth. Oh, hey, Scott, I read your book. I really liked it. So he knew who I was. And I said, look, I'm starting to search. And he says, you bet, I'm all in. And then he changed it. He said, and after we find these grave sites, we're going to exhume the bodies and we're going to identify these people, use DNA. So meanwhile, so I've got to go quick. We're off in the running. I have an assistant, a volunteer assistant named Dick Warner, a retired forklift salesman who's a volunteer at the Tulsa Historical Society. Turns out to be a brilliant researcher. For 2.5 years, Dick and I go to work on this. We interview 300 Tulsans, survivors, observers, cemetery workers, funeral home workers, city personnel, regular citizens. We uncover records that I never thought would exist, that people hadn't looked at in 75 years, including funeral home ledgers in white funeral homes where they billed the county for burying riot victims, identified and unidentified. The Clyde Snow brought in the state archaeologist. He also brought in other scholars, including Dr. Leslie Rankin-Hill, a renowned anthropologist who has a specialty in African-American burial sites. She's was one of the keys on the African burial ground in Manhattan. We bring together this team. There's this young graduate student I've heard about, Phoebe Stubblefield. She's brought on as well too. We identify 3 sites in Tulsa. This is in the late 1990s. One at Oak Lawn Cemetery, a segregated city-owned cemetery. One at what is now New Block Park, which had been sort of a city dump in 1921. And the third at a historic African-American cemetery called the Booker T. Washington Cemetery. We did ground radar, somewhat primitive in those days. All 3 sites, mixed results. And then the rug got pulled out from us because news of our search for the mass graves became national and then international news. This was all over the place. We got caught up in the politics of the Race Riot Commission. There were some commissioners who hated the fact that news to the riot was happening. They were mad at us for that. There were others who were, and the scholars, we were all pro reparations, but there were other reparations activists, conspiracy theory believers who thought that our work was taking away from their effort to win reparations. There was also a battle between the scholars, which included John Hope Franklin as well too, to control our report. The scholars win the report, and so to punish us, the Riot Commission shut down any more work on the graves. That was then followed by the city of Tulsa, who was quite happy to shut down our work as well too. And so we closed up shop in 2000. I packed away all of my gear, my records. I thought, well, someday somebody will want to know about this, but I didn't know whether it would happen during my lifetime. And it did. In 2019, I was contacted by the deputy mayor of Tulsa, asked about my work. I went and met with the mayor, and he asked me to help coordinate and lead up the new search. Automatically, of course, I thought of Dr. Rankenhill and Phoebe. I said, let's get the band back together. Let's get going. Meanwhile, there were a lot of other people who were already on board, the state archaeologists, people in the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey. So we are now back at it. We still have our 3 sites, but we've added kind of an asterisk, a 4th site, a homeless camp called the Canes, which is near New Block Park. And with that, Phoebe, I've said more than I probably should have. And I want to thank you. And I'm now going to mute myself.
All right. Thank you, Scott. All right. I'm going to share my screen and move into my presentation. Okay. Say that. Yes, I have done it. Okay. There we go. All right. Okay. So thanks again, Scott. So I wanted to warn everyone. Well, I have a blank screen to tell me to warn everyone. So there are a few human remains in this presentation. They're not human remains associated with Tulsa at all, because we don't, we are purposefully not taking pictures of the human remains we are now encountering in the Tulsa recovery. I may speak more about that later, but just consider that an issue of we want to have the people of Tulsa control those images very directly. And so there aren't any images in this presentation. There might be in future ones, I don't know. I'm leaving that purely up to the people of Tulsa as custodians for those remains. And, you know, think of them as the next of kin. So these remains are images that have actually been previously used in teaching in various contexts, mine, others. So, but they are my best illustration of some of the issues we're encountering here or expectations you could have about this process. So I want to start by thanking, in addition to Scott, our great team. Yes, I'm pretty sure I'm speaking correctly if I say that I have not worked with such a great team ever in my life. And I've been on some pretty good field, you know, away moments, I would say. And but this particular group, and the membership changes by a few, you know, between events, and I'm calling this the original 18 crew. It's very much like the Sexton Dig crew, but and we try and take a group picture each time. But I wanted to especially thank this crew, Mayor Bynum and the entire mayor's office, the city commissioners who approved the funding for this search, the city crew, Terry Ball, who manages the Oak Lawn Cemetery, where most of this presentation takes place. Mark Hogan, who is something like a city manager, because he makes things happen. When you say, hey, can I get something? Suddenly it appears. Sometimes even when you're just speculating out loud about how nice coffee would be in the afternoon, and suddenly there's a coffee maker. So my thanks to him. My thanks to all of the University of Oklahoma crew, because we have some unsung heroes there, in addition to the state archaeologist Carrie Stackelbeck and her colleague Scott Hammerstead and Amanda Rainier, who did the geophysical surveying and mapping for our project. Carrie's husband Greg was quite pivotal in the first part of the dig. The 2 geologists, Lee Bement and Deb Green. Usually I would say that every forensic anthropologist needs a chemist. I'm thinking of changing that to geologist, especially if they are Deb Green and Lee Bement. They may be, you know, covetous. I may be coveting them because they are great, and you'll see some images of them. The Public Oversight Committee, especially our observers and members who are there every time. But the chair, Brenda Alford, she is fantastic. Our constant videographer, really, Kevin Ross. And we have a intermittent third position from the Public Oversight Committee, but these individuals have been with us all the way, and they have been willing to contribute. They aren't just observers, they're part of the team. And the crew itself operating the heavy equipment, the backhoe operators, and it takes more than 2 people to run a backhoe, and it takes at least 4. And that's just the backhoe, but that's another story. So, oh, sorry, my light does that. There we go. There we go. Okay, sorry, it's on timer. Gotta save energy. So at any rate, we together managed to make the group brain. And anytime you can be on a team like that, where you can make the group brain, it is a moment to be truly appreciated. And by that, I mean that some of the problems we encountered as we pursued this operation, we were solving in real time as best we could, because this is an historical investigation. So long story short, these people are great. They're just great. We are great. And I just strongly appreciate that. I'm grateful. So this is the kind of mob action I always want to be a part of. We create good, not evil. So my journey here, I mean, Scott did, he remembers better, but he's a historian, and so I rely on that. My presence here, I say, started 20 years ago, and I had read a newspaper article about Clyde Snow's effort to find the disappeared of Tulsa. And so I was like, wait a minute, I'm a forensic anthropologist, budding forensic anthropologist, and I know things about Tulsa. My parents grew up there, and I visited the city every summer for, all of my childhood, essentially. So this first image you're seeing is Clyde Wood's photography. It's the temporal family link I have with Tulsa in association with the Race Massacre. So the Woods family. I met Clyde, that's why I put his image in there. I mean, I swam in his pool most summers. He passed away in '87, but you know how it is with family. I didn't realize the significance of his career until after I found this image of his shop. But to me, that shop was just that stoop that we always entered through into his studio. But his father, Clyde's father, was Ellis Walker Woods. Ellis Walker Woods was the principal of Booker T. Washington High School, which was a field hospital during the Race Massacre recovery. And Ellis Walker Woods himself, he has a memorial there in Tulsa. Near, they're kind of like 2, but anyway, there's a memorial there where you can read more about his career. But he was an encourager as well as principal of the high school. So meaning he would tell people things like, you're as good as 99% of the people and better than the rest. And an encourager is a good person to have in a place like Tulsa at that time period, when Black people have been free of slavery for several decades, but not so long that you don't have relatives who grew up in slavery or were born in slavery. 1921 is not that long. And if you have grandparents, and the mindset of Black Tulsans, especially Blacks coming to Oklahoma, a lot of that had to do with finally having freedom, gradually moving away from the true South and encountering, especially in an oil boom town, the true freedom of the American dream, where you can live and run your economy and be prosperous and be like everyone else. But you're a Black person whose parents came from slavery. But no, you're just like everyone else. And Tulsa had that element to it as an oil town. So at any rate, Ellis Walker Woods. So how am I connected to him? His wife, his second wife, I've just found out. I didn't realize he had another wife until I was looking in the city directories. And he acquired his second wife, Anna Woods. I don't know what happened to Alberta Lee, but that's another investigation. Anna Woods was the sister of my grandfather's second wife. There's a lot of second wife over here. And to show how small the connections are, I was just idly looking at this draft registration card for my grandfather, And notice who he said would always know his address. So E.W. Woods, and that's the house they were living in at that time, and the house shortly after the race massacre, the rebuilt house was there on North Detroit that the Woods were living in. So the family connection was already there by then. He'd already married Anna's sister, but I only knew that there was an Aunt Anna. That's all I knew. You know, I was not born when Ellis Walker Woods passed away, and Anna Woods survived all of her family. So no, not all of them, many of them. But I knew her sons better than her identity. And the time period in which I started investigating my family history in strong effort was the same year, or certainly the same temporal period, 1998, that I heard about the race massacre. And I heard about the race massacre in the context of the investigation. You know, we were calling it the race riot then, but, you know, I contacted my parents and said, hey, you know, I've been invited to be a part of this effort to provide the part of the report on what forensic anthropology will contribute to this investigation. And my parents, or my mother said, well, your Aunt Anna lost her house to the race massacre. And so, of course, I said, Aunt Anna, you know, and so the rest was research. But because the rest of my family was not in Tulsa yet, you know, my grandmother wasn't there yet. And all that was built later. So when I came on board, my main interest in the investigation back when it was the commission 20 years ago was literally to find those that had died in this riot process. I was thinking that the science itself was really the issue, and I did not have a personal attachment yet, you know, because I was still connecting to my family that I couldn't see even at that time. You know, in 98, I was just thinking, okay, well, we're looking for a set of people. And to show you my bias, even at that time, I assumed they were all Black. I didn't even consider that whites had been killed in the effort to kill Blacks, or even for any other reason. Because remember, a riot, you know, just can produce dead people, even if you're not involved. And that concept wasn't in my mind. But I was aware that we were looking for individuals for whom the standard, our everyday concept of the postmortem process would not have applied to them. So, and that would be an equal injustice against these Black victims, because I thought they'd only be Black. So by that postmortem process, I mean, now, and probably even in the state law then, because we get our death investigation customs from, most states do get it from our traditions from England. And so we just transported the death investigation customs directly over as colonists. So what does that mean? That means if someone dies, well, I want to say if a guy dies, really, but let's just say if someone dies, then you hold an inquest if you're using a traditional coroner system. And if you're fancy and have attached a medical doctor to your death investigation system, you might call him, usually a him in this context, a medical examiner. If you have, or he may be coroner, but that's not traditional. But if you have a doctor attached, then you might have a doctor conducting autopsies. If not, that's still fine. You still proceed. You just call a jury to inspect the remains and make an opinion about the cause of death and who caused it. And you've held the forum. The forum meets to decide about that death, to make a decision about the context of that death. So that could be like the original context might be something like, is it a suicide? Because if it's a suicide, then we don't want to bury them in the churchyard. So we really do need to know if it's a suicide or not. But if it's almost any other form of death, manner of death rather, you don't have an issue. So, you know, if it's a homicide, then you're looking for the perpetrator. If it's an accident, well, accidents happen. If they died of old age or other natural causes, unless that cause, well, you still investigate sometimes. I'll just say sometimes. And if you just can't figure it out, well, you write that down too. You can't figure it out. And so we do death investigations as a tradition in our country. But the people for the Tulsa Race Massacre, they didn't receive any death investigations. Some of them do have death certificates, and they're obvious Cause of death is listed, like a gunshot wound, that gunshot wound. Sometimes the location might be recorded, but the source of that wound, there weren't any further investigations. And considering the context of the time, I get it, because it's summer, it was June, and they had many dead. And so if there were more than we are currently, than we currently have documented, because we're looking at, let's say, tens of bodies, so like 40, 50. I fully expect to see around 40 minimal. And so, well, if we add everyone together, black and white. So if we have 40 to 50 decedents, and even in that many over 2 days in the summer, there's a problem with timing. So you would have to have a well-developed death investigation system without this idea that Black people don't get the same services from your country as white people to pull off an investigation at that time period. And you know, what do I mean by, there's an issue there by the same services. So those of you who've done your research, like I tried to find some relatives from before, some grandparents and great-grandparents. I said, hey, they own property. I know where they own the property. I almost know the address of the house. So I look at the tax records. They didn't pay taxes. And it took me a while to figure that out. And then I thought, oh, wait a minute, this is the early 1920s. You probably ran from taxes. You know, you physically had to pay them, so you'd run. I'm like, oh, okay. And then I learned that actually quite often Black people weren't taxed. And that was one of the freedoms of emancipation, the lack of taxation frequently, because you weren't a citizen. And citizens don't get services, so you don't pay taxes. And that context of who are these people? Who are these Black people in the context of our city services, our city processes? All that is applying in this context of, whoa, you know, we got all these dead people, let's bury them, dead Black people. And you can see a reflection of that if you read the newspaper articles. I'm not a historian, keep that in mind. I've only read a few of the newspaper articles from the Tulsa Tribune and then also the Tulsa Daily World, and centering around those days, June 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 1921. But what I've noticed is often the Black decedents are called insurrectionists. You know, they are at fault. When they're described with the ones who were killed, who were murdered outright, like Dr. Jackson. He was this Black physician in Tulsa, already famous, and he was just murdered coming out of his house. And so he was described and in the paper as Dr. Jackson, well-known, almost world-renowned Black surgeon, well-liked by people of his color and others, he's described that way. And he was killed coming out of his house. And if you read Mary Parrish's book on her eyewitness account, she has a vignette by a man who also lived in the house, who said he had to dodge aside to prevent being the next one killed automatically coming out of that house. But he saw that Dr. Jackson was killed. So Dr. Jackson murdered gets a description. Another man who was a porter at a local bank, he gets a description. He's not one of the shooters, but everyone who was a shooter gets a name if they're known, and that's it. You know, sometimes, mainly a name. And they, most of the ones that we're interested in from that list have a documented, shortly to be better documented, but a documented burial location. But in the papers, they don't rank more than just a description. So there's already this thought of, these are the perpetrators. But what about the circumstances of the riot? And I'll show you a picture and a map and tell you what I find interesting about this concept of Black people, Black shooters are automatically at fault versus white shooters who were mobbing to perform a lynching. I'll show you a picture in a second. So, but we'll get to that. So at the very least, my intent was to add to this history, add the biological component to the history of the Tulsa Race Massacre dead. And find some way to add substance to the survivor accounts. Because one of the things Scott didn't mention is how by the time, I learned about the narrative, the overall narrative of, oh, there was a riot. There was part of the story was that, oh, that was just black on black crime. That was black people burning their properties down. And while that is not an old story, I've since learned, since it was in the papers almost immediately in those June days, have it become the history, the verbal history, the way you just glossed over, oh, we don't need to study that because that was just those black people over there burning their houses down. That harms, that narrative, that public narrative creates harm. It's part of the burden of harm for the people of Tulsa who've grown up with the knowledge of the event, but less and less ability to substantiate it because and this is pre-internet. So it's not like you could sit down and look at many scans of papers until you find that, oh, okay, there's enough of Tulsa Tribune or Tulsa Daily World or the Veneta newspaper or international sources where you can start building a picture of what actually happened. Pre-internet, you just had, physically go somewhere or have someone tell you what happened. And the narrative was, oh, it didn't happen. You guys did it to yourselves. And there was never a Greenwood, an economic zone. What was that? So more to validate. And then remember that the death investigations occur to provide, I like to say, usually we're here to provide necessary knowledge for the public, usually in an imminent sense of the dead teach the living. Autopsies are how we find out that we have a problem. Autopsies, or sometimes hospitals, like if you think of our current pandemic and how information was coming out of China before, before the virus got here. Maybe if you ignore that woman that died, well, at any rate, we had information early enough because of information sharing. And sometimes autopsies are the way you get that information that there's something virulent, but it's also the way we get the information about slower modes of death or about homicides or who's committed, maybe not the who, there's more investigation on the who, but that an act was a homicide, the autopsy. So, and that's in the public interest to know that. And so at the very least, it could be something as interesting as where are people shot, the direction the bullet is traveling. Because we have an interest in people being shot in the back versus in the front. We're curious about that. So, so what happened? So even then, 20 years ago, we had 3 locations, and these were collected from the narrative of the interviews that Scott and Dick Warner were putting together. And so this is a mashup of yesterday and today in a sense. So I'm saying, oh, where are the mass graves? So people said, oh, okay, New Block Park. I'll show you a picture of New Block Park. Not a great one, but still a picture. And the Canes is, I'm considering the Canes possibly a subset of that, but it's something we're investigating now, and I'll show you why. Booker T. Washington Cemetery has been renamed the Rolling Oaks Memorial Garden. And more on that later. And then Oak Lawn Cemetery. So here's a map of Tulsa. And so this is after my colleagues we have a similar map in our report. I just left on it the interesting features, like here's a nice quick trip. And, but here's the Arkansas River here. And so site 1 on this map is New Block Park. So it's got some nice green shading. Trees, plenty of trees. And then over here, I stuck it in the river because the Canes is really this part right here. It was a bare spit back in 1921, but just a bare area underneath this railroad trestle, which is the critical part here, railroad trestle. And then 3 is all the way over here, Oak Lawn. And then this little star is where Ellis Walker Woods was living. So this is to give you a concept of what we're dealing with, because here's downtown Tulsa. So the area where the rioting begins, the fighting begins, the first shot fired. And here's where people were, here's Greenwood District is up here. And the house that my aunt and uncle lost up here. So North Tulsa isn't right smack in downtown. You know, they had to actually go and destroy it. I mean, it helped that they were lobbing turpentine balls out of airplanes. You know, it was a committed effort on the part of white Tulsans to eradicate Greenwood, and I get that. But you know, this isn't an accident. This isn't even everyday rioting. If you compare it to, well, I only compared it really to one riot. I ignored the Watts riot because temporally I'm out of date, but I compared it to Rodney King, and the police efforts for that in LA kept the fighting mainly in, I mean, the rioting, the property destruction, mainly in the part of LA I grew up in. So at any rate, moving on. So here's a view of New Block Park in 2005 when I was visiting there. That waterworks building is no longer there, but you go waterworks, yeah, there was construction in the area. So we were on to New Block Park, and because of an eyewitness who said, oh, I saw construction going on where they were putting in a large concrete. I thought it was a pool, and their New Block Park does have a pool, but that pool hadn't gone in at the time period that the eyewitness was aware. It was walking through the park, but he saw a lot of human remains disturbed in the excavation. So he went back and got a souvenir skull, but when he tried to go back to get another one, the area had been filled or the remains were gone, and he was told that they were riot dead, buried there. Now, if you look at, this is what New Block Park looks like to, well, you know, on a nice summer day, more recently, that's the structure now, not the old waterworks building. And I'm standing on a levee. So this is a developed landform. So it's not a, right off the bat, we know we're not dealing with 1921 surfaces. So it has its own challenges. So we did do some various geophysical tests. We really had three. We used electrical impedance, which looks at how well electrical signals travel, how well they travel through the soil. You know, moist soils are great, but it can give you a picture of how well the electricity can or cannot move to the soil, so you get a picture. But it doesn't like having overhead power lines, and neither does a magnetic resonance magnetometer that we also used. And unfortunately, this area has overhead power lines. So the GPR did give us some good signals, good information, because there's pipes going through here, and we could see where the sewer lines we knew about were showing up on the GPR, but the information we got only went down about 1.5 feet. And yeah, about 1.5 feet. And that's important later, but or important now if you consider that we already knew there was a levee there that had been built up, and so we were not sensing through the levee. So if anyone had been buried at surface level and the levee was on top of that, we can't sense that. So not with our current tools. So that's where we stop right now for a New Block Park. But notice that, so this is another view of New Block Park here on the left, and there are the rail lines right there. And this view right here is the canes, and the trestle goes right past it in a way where if you parked a rail car on the tracks, you could unload bodies directly downhill onto the spit of land and bury them in a trench, say. And that is a narrative we received from a ex-law enforcement, ex-police, Tulsa police. And he said he saw a training photo. Well, he saw a photo while in training one night, one of those late nights, hey, do you want to see this moments? And the CVs were photos, a box of photos from the Tulsa Race Massacre, and they were photos we've not been able to find since and not seen. And he said there were photos of a dead family draped over a fence, dead Black family, and a photo of a mass grave on the slope, the bare area that was, before it was the canes, it was this bare spit of land, and a steam shovel had nearby that had apparently dug the trench, and people moving bodies from an overhead rail car and staging them onto that spit, you know, lining them up for burial. So we're very interested in the canes, even though, you know, is it a Is it a one-off narrative? Not quite. And notice how close together the two locations are, New Block and the Canes. They really are adjacent. I'll flip back. But we wonder if after all the time period, I'm just going to flip back to this world map, we wonder if these areas in their telling are really one because they're along the railroad. Or maybe they're two mass graves. We don't know. Part of the uncertainty is that we have documentation for funeral home burials. So those people sometimes have names and they sort of have locations if you squint. But we don't have records for National Guard burials. When the National Guard came in, we don't know how they, and we do know that the Red Cross, not Red Cross, Salvation Army came in and hired grave diggers, but we don't know who they buried or where. And I think I'll show you this newspaper clipping that suggests that these weren't the burials we have in Oak Lawn weren't from the Salvation Army, but it's not well documented. So we only have one type of burial documented, and those are the funeral home ones. So here's the other side of the Canes. That's a bit of a problem, and you could call this my well, I'm glad I realized this now and not 20 years ago moment, because if you peek off here in the distance, that's a tent. And there's a little bit of some kind of structure right there. The Canes is a homeless camp. And by homeless, I mean families, at least one family. Scott and I visited the place in 2019 and disturbed a family. You know, a man, a woman, baby carriage, dog, family living out there. So that presents a problem for further investigation because none of those trees were there in 1921, let alone homeless camp. And so, you know, to pursue the investigation, we need to raise the area. And it's just, you know, just homeless living, ooh, but it's living, you know. And so, and then there's the issue of, well, it's been a homeless camp for quite a while now. And those of you who've done backyard excavations, I mean, if any of you out there are of the forensic type, and my forensic type, the forensic anthropological type, and have had to dig people up out of their backyards and have discovered, especially if they've been hidden in the yard, they no informant, and have discovered how many backyard trash pits there are. Or if you've run ground penetrating radar in backyards and notice that it's just signal after signal after signal because every soda can and can gives a signal. There's a disturbance in the soil matrix. Well, look at the Canes. I mean, it's one large camp, like one large backyard / midden. And so the top of it will have to be scraped off alone. But what's interesting to me is we did get a little bit of ground penetrating radar data. My colleague Scott and Amanda went out there and they surveyed some of the areas that were already relatively clear, because like you can see there's a path here, but there are a few clear rings, and they saw some areas that looked like, these could be burials. And they could be, but consider the depth. If they're burials and not a midden or a privy, then they could be forensic burials. So this was one of the, and I mean forensic in the traditional sense of these are individuals who will be relatively fresh and relatively easier to ID because someone might be looking for them or they might have living family, and but still otherwise not related to our investigation, which is for 100 years previous, going on 100, about to be 100 years. So while those signals are interesting, we are hoping to get the overall view if we can resolve our various conflicts, because it is city land and it's not like a labeled homeless camp. It's not a homeless village. It's an area where people live free and do a lot of drugs, and occasionally, they live there on their own. And so I have trouble seeing that the outcome will be in their favor as far as us not investigating. But let's just tackle that when the moment comes, because we still have one other site to consider, even though this site is about third on my list because it has its own complications. Booker T. Washington Cemetery is privately owned. It is now Rolling Oaks Memorial Garden. And so the narrative, the history obtained from eyewitnesses is that this cemetery was the location where individuals, as they were doing rebuilding, doing the recovery and encountering human remains, where they took the human remains. So Rolling Oak Cemetery is not near, it's in an area called Jenks, a town that was called Jenks, Tulsa. And now, I mean, I call it Jenks, Tulsa. It's like living in LA and saying, I'm gonna go to Inglewood. And you go, oh, Inglewood's separate from LA? Yes, yeah, it is, but you know, it's right there. Only Jenks is further away. Well, it depends on which part of LA you're living in. So you know what I mean. Jenks is like that to Tulsa. It's like Santa Monica relative to where I grew up in LA. So I would say, oh, like Santa Monica. So you drive out to Jenks and there's a cemetery, Booker T. Washington Cemetery, and Black people were burying remains of probably Black people out there in the cemetery. Now, what's the complication? I mean, we don't know where in it. We know the general area from eyewitnesses. It was beyond the boundary. What was in a boundary of the cemetery? There was like a thicket, and the thicket was left undisturbed because the riot dead had been buried there. But it's had some development since then. And that's the other problem. This is why. So the Memorial Garden is an active memorial garden, but to a lot of these markers, and you'll notice that they're like half snap lines. Like the distance here isn't 6 feet or enough space to lay a coffin out. And so I was like, are they putting them in vertical or what are they? Yeah, they're putting them in vertical because they're urn burials. So the owner has urn burials on top of the existing or marked, unmarked. We can't be sure, but you know, to keep the space in use, they're urn burials now in association with the previous coffin burials. And so this is a concentrated scene as a result. Then to make it more complicated, the owner lives somewhere in California, and he will not allow us to survey the area until he can be physically present. All good until COVID. So we don't have a timeline for the survey of this cemetery, but we already know it's going to be an interesting moment because you can see it is garden-like because it does have many trees, and there are plenty of markers, but there are markers next to markers. We were standing on markers. They were covered up. It's not an obviously organized space. So, and it gets slightly lower priority in my book. So what about Oak Lawn? So Oak Lawn, from our beginning back 20 years ago, we knew we were going to investigate areas in Oak Lawn. And this is again one of my temporal mashup moments because this is the recent, our recent report showing where we surveyed, and it's handy because it shows where we excavated. So the orange lines just show where we took geophysical data, ground penetrating radar, or the electrical impedance, or the radiometer. We took geophysical data. So the areas of interest, because of the results of the geophysical data here. So we call this spot the Sexton area. I know it says Sexton area, but so the Sextons had a narrative. They had a narrative, oral history, that there was, and see, I'm a little, because now I'm hesitating because I know what we dug up there. And so I want to say that somewhere in the cemetery, there was a mass grave somewhere in Oak Lawn, not necessarily right here. And that this line of crepe myrtles in this nice intersecting pattern had been installed by a sexton to memorialize these victims. Now, the written documents about the cemetery, there's a gap. And if you look at the modern map that we have, I'm sorry I didn't give you guys that map, but if you look at the map, there are no headstones here. This area is nicely blank. There are headstones here, And this is a tightly organized cemetery. So there's like some 1930 headstones right here in this line, 1930. But here is blank. So we're all like, hey, let's look there. And we got geophysical signals that suggested that there were a tight boundary. And that's why 4 has boundaries. So a bordered area on our ground penetrating radar, we got signal that showed linear disturbances at a north and south boundary on about a 30-foot, with about a 30-foot distance in between. So, you know, linear borders, cemetery, Sexton area. So we said, well, we'll dig there. So we also had, so down here is the Potter's Field. So there's a Jim Crow line somewhere in here. So if you're somewhere over here, and you know, I know there's a Jim Crow line there. I don't know where it is. I just know that if you're near here, you're black, and somewhere over here you turn white. You're still dead, but you're buried in the cemetery with more whiteness somewhere over here and black over here. So I visited this area in 2005. That we call it the Clyde Eddy area, and Mr. Eddy was still alive. So we went to look at it, and it was good. I did. We still have a little bit of uncertainty about exactly where he saw. What he saw was staging of burials for bodies that were stored inside large crates. So he was a kid that would cut through the cemetery, and he cut through on, I think it was the 1st, might have been the 2nd of June, saw these crates sitting there, and guys, there were 3 crates, and guys digging a hole. So he peeked in the crates and saw multiple bodies in each crate, and then peeks in another one, sees the same thing, gets shooed away. But he knows that they were staging burials here in the white part of the Potter's Field. So I went to try and get an idea of where that is, and I could not find my physical notes. This is another one of those moments where you go, oh, make notes more obvious, because the best I can recollect is that I stood in one spot and just kept taking pictures to try and get an overall idea of the general area, because Mr. Eddy, you know, walked out to about where he saw the containers and pointed, and ignore that his children are pointing because they weren't there. But this is the general area that Mr. Eddy indicated. The Scotty dog's still there. And I kept a view of, that's the sexton's house in the distance there, still in good shape. But by turning, I'm hoping we can reconstruct where the area is. Now, why do we have to? Because our geophysical report from the late 90s indicated that there was a ground penetrating radar anomaly in the Clyde Eddy area. But when we resurveyed it last year, we did not identify an anomaly. And then we resurveyed it 2 years. We've resurveyed twice, and we aren't finding any anomaly. So any geophysical anomaly. We're not exactly convinced, though, and by we I mean the physical investigation team. That's, you know, everyone on it, the archaeologists, the forensic anthropologists, this particular historian guy. We're not convinced that we have the right spot when we all start comparing notes. And so, not sure, we're not done with the Clyde Eddy, it's a long story short, with the Clyde Eddy site. Now, so this past July, we went to Oak Lawn because it's the obvious space, it's public land. I mean, the city owns it, so the city can do its own investigation. We don't have to wait on property owner, and we don't have to wait to raise the area and clear it off enough where we can look at it. So we went to Oak Lawn. So that was the July 13th through July 22nd, the Sexton area dig. So this first search, it targeted this area here where we found this bordered anomaly on the ground penetrating radar. So area 4. So again, no headstones in this area. So we started our excavation. So we were optimistic. So so my colleague Carrie Stackelbeck, state archaeologist, the state of Oklahoma, she lined out the area that we should start digging. We got the forensic backhoe out, and you can see our proximity to the fence. That's important later, but this is very much a public event. And even though as a forensic anthropologist, I'm often very guarded about the public proximity to scenes, because what do I worry about? That some part of dead body will end up on Instagram or on Twitter. Actually, that may have happened in this context, but I couldn't confirm it because I'm not very good with Twitter. I'm learning. But at any rate, the one plus about being right next to the fence is that it gives us such transparency, because remember, this investigation is delayed. So, it's almost 100 years too late, when it should have occurred within the first weeks. And it really should have. I mean, they were saying they were going to investigate. Something like an investigation was called for in the first week, if you read the papers from then. But that didn't cause an autopsy, or at any rate. The other issue is there's been a lot of distrust, because remember 20 years ago, we did try to do something and the commission dissolved itself rather than let our report be released. And so there was infighting. Scott can tell you how the media, TV media at the time would portray the investigation as a money grab, as a way to waste taxpayers' money. When I went to one of the commission meetings, there weren't any people there except a handful, and none of them were Black. Well, except me, and then maybe John Hope Franklin, I think, was there. And that was it. And, is this investigation not about, the Black people of Tulsa? Yeah, but were they there? No. And, remember this, there was, let's see, was there internet? Yeah, there was internet, but not like we enjoy it now. So, and with TV being the dominant media, we weren't getting the coverage that would cause public support. So now we have that public support. And I don't just mean in the, I do mean in part in the, we stand behind what you do, because if I think about it too much, I'll start crying about some of the contact I've had over the fence. But I look at it like, here, you can tell we are actually investigating. We are transparent, because one of the things we haven't been able to do, is it something you do? But often I'm the only Black person there. And while in one sense, we haven't read skeletal material yet, that race is a real component of this investigation. It is real, because distrust is real. And, sometimes I have trouble explaining it, or maybe I over-explain it. I can't know, the space isn't sufficiently interactive for me to know, but I'm faculty. My students are mostly white. I've always had mostly white students because I taught in North Dakota for 15 years. But even before then, when I taught at UF as an adjunct, students were mostly white. I'm not saying that you can't be a mostly white student. What I'm saying is I don't know the perspective of Blackness in multiple contexts of, context of being, an academic. But because, I grew up in LA. I did not grow up in Tulsa. And then I went to college 3 times. And I'm not hanging around Black people who've gone to college a bunch of times and have this other set of ideas and a whole other vocabulary interfacing with the way they've grown up. I don't know that other experience. I only know my own. And because I reflect from my own, what I see is that many of the people that I interact with, the people of Tulsans, the Black people of Tulsans, the Black Tulsans, have been wounded by the delay in this investigation and the lack of investigation, wounded. And even though they weren't there to see the riot, or they may be a second generation out on the recovery, living with the aftermath, they are wounded. And part of that wounding means, how do you trust a white person? And yet I look at our team and we're great. We are great. And I have to stop and go, but you know, not everyone will be able to see that. I get it. Their perspective has more race trauma in it, and I get it. The advice my father gave me, my father who grew up in Tulsa, when I graduated from college the first time, and he saw that I did not have a lot of Black friends, but you know, it's academia. Where are you going to get them? Seriously. But at any rate, his advice to me was, you can't trust white people. That was his happy graduation gift. And in the context, I said, well, you know, these aren't white people. We were at a church-related graduation party. I said, they're church people. They're not white. So in that regard, I was correct. But I get it now, even more. I had to get a little older and see my parents as individuals, not parents, and watch them be with their siblings and visit with them at high school reunions as, you know, adults in Tulsa, and see that, I had to listen to my aunts say, my aunts, one is still living, I had to listen to them say when I said, hey, let's go to this diner on Route 66. It goes right through Tulsa there in a nice way. Let's go to this diner. And my aunts look at each other and say, do Black people go there? And I'm like, no. Yeah, they got money, they go there. But in LA, if you have money, you go there. I'm not saying that racial things don't happen in LA, because come on, Rodney King. But at any rate, my perspective has more, it's based on growing up with fewer episodes in it than and I recognize that context may not be shared. And so look at the fence, and I go, yeah, we've got transparency. Long story short. So what did we see here? Look at that nice soil. It's not all the way the red, feared red clay that I was thinking about. One of the worst preserved cases I ever had was from Alabama red clay. Part of the poor preservation was they excavated it with a fire hose, but it's clay. It's very dense and labor intensive. So I can kind of understand that. But we were hoping not to see that based on our collective, we, the archaeologists and I, based on our knowledge of Tulsa. So here we all are. And this, unfortunately, is a typical view of anthropologists of any kind and geologists digging. You'll see either our heads crouched down or our backsides, because that's just the picture that you get. But we're already about a meter down. Probably here is about a meter down, and we're not. So we're starting to think, okay, we're going to start seeing burials, if there are burials here. But we weren't looking for coffins at this depth. We were looking for changes in soil layers such that we could see soil intrusion, soil. And we weren't seeing any intrusions. And so that we were starting to get a little concerned. So look, the hole's gotten even bigger, and we didn't see any signs of burials interrupting the soil landscape. And here we thought, we found something. So that's why we're all crouched there looking, because we thought, is this a color change? No, we kept finding a lot of debris, a lot of fill items. Yeah, the hole got even deeper, but this time we're at like getting close to 2 meters. So I thought, okay, I better have my drape ready. That's why I'm crouched there with the sheet, because we're by the fence. And so I thought, I'm going to have to quickly throw this sheet over, or stand up with it, and hide the fact that we encountered human remains. My colleague, Angela Berg from the Oklahoma Medical Examiner's Office, was also standing by. But by this point, we hadn't hit remains. So what we were hitting consistently were layers of fill. So we saw ground level and then general cemetery fill. So cemetery fill usually is soil that has cemetery products in it, whoops, I call them. So things like if you had glass viewing panes from coffins, you find panes of glass. If you have, so there'll be coffin nails, there'll be temporary grave markers. So you don't find human remains because they're not disinterments. They're just either whoops or just things that broke along the way, and they end up in cemetery backfill. So the backfill pile. So we were seeing low levels of this, no fancy, nothing fancier than like half a temporary grave marker, the rod half. Sometimes the head, the plate that has you put the name on it with a little metal strip, or bricks. We found a lot of bricks. And the best thing we found in all that fill in the first 2 days of digging was this cartridge. This turned into a communication error, but we got it resolved. It's a squash cartridge. We were arguing over the caliber, but a bullet cartridge, but it wasn't from our event because it was just part of the fill. There was no burial, and bullet cartridges happen everywhere. The construction grade fill tended to have more of the bricks. And then we got to what I call construction grade fill light, because it had a lot of, very mostly soil, but then you'd hit the occasional brick or the occasional pottery shard, and but mostly soil. So we kept seeing layers of this. So we realized, oh, this is it's all fill. This is all a landform. So we decided to head south. So we dug a trench heading south, trench B, we called it. So that trench followed the line of crepe myrtles. We found increasing fill, the same layers we found earlier, and then the objects in it started to get larger. And especially as we went deeper, when we started to reach about 3 meters-ish, we started to encounter more intact objects like whole glass, amorphous, rusty things. Okay, yeah, I know that's a lamp, but this is the bucket of shame. And beneath that, all these items are just the amorphous globs of rust that we harassed Amanda Rainier with to ID when she told us not to bring those out. She only wanted the pottery sherds because often they were reconstructible and she can get good timeline information from the kitchen crocks and half plates that we were also finding. Well, half plates actually kind of big. Our largest objects were the bottles, the bottles. We started core sampling, augers in this case, to find out how the soil varied as we went deeper, because we had hit relatively sterile soil. Even though it was fill, it was fill that was laying on top of bedrock, decomposing bedrock in the first trench. And so heading further south, we just dug through that layer, and we're starting to hit silty clay, sandy clay, and eventually we were pretty convinced that we were probably in a relic stream and following it along. I'll show you a very not so good picture of that later, of the idea of that. But here is the faunal material. So this is our bone. This is the bone we found. So you can see this nice sharp edge. That's a saw edge. If you look at it, I mean, not in that bag, but they're striae. So this is a nice butchered bone. This is some of the best in here too. Nice butchery marks, mostly cow, rib. This is a piece of rib. This was a piece of ilium. And so these are butcher cuts. Sorry, hip bone, piece of hip bone from a roast. And so a few flakes of amorphous unidentified cortical bone, but the fill was oddly absent of skeletal material until we got more pieces as we got into the true midden area. And this Harvest King whiskey was one of our better bottles too. This one has a good date stamp because it dates to the distillery closed at Prohibition. So we got an idea of the lower end of our timeline on that particular midden. And this is the overview of our whole Sexton dig. So we follow the crepe myrtles, and we dug down to the midden area all the way to bedrock at about 15 to 17 feet. We went that deep because we kept finding objects. We found a pair of shoes sitting beside each other. And then other times we found one shoe. And then all the bottles and crockery. So we kept thinking, maybe, is it a midden or not a midden? You know, because you can have a pair of shoes in a midden. It was a midden. It might have been a privy. I have a bad feeling it might have been a privy. The soil was very dark and rich. And any of those of you who dug privies know that if in the good world, everything turns to dirt. And we did not have odors of, it'd been a while, but the soil was uniformly very dark. And we only dug the northern edge of the midden, the northern edge of it. It makes a geomagnetic anomaly, and we only dug its northern edge of it when we became convinced that, yeah, we were finding a lot of artifacts and no human bones. And so we called it an excavation. So that was what happened with the July Sexton area dig. Every anomaly that we found on the geophysical data, we could justify with something we dug up. Like here, the multiple layers of soil, Over here, road bed, they internal cemetery road that they paved at least twice in its history before they covered it up. And right about here, we hit a curbstone. Literally, we dug up a whole curb, and there's probably another one like it up there. And so, yeah, that was the southern boundary, was the curbstone of the what we thought was a mass grave, turned out to be a curb and the street. So we go, okay, that's why you test. Instead of saying definitely a mass grave, we had signals that made us suspicious, and it turned out to be unknown landscaping. We had no record of change for the cemetery, and technically we're still a little light on that. So we looked at some aerial photographs, and you may notice that this photograph is upside down, but I did that because I wanted the railroad to follow. This is Oak Lawn, and I wanted the railroad to follow its course that normally, that is in. So I wanted to be looking north. And this picture looks to the southern end of Tulsa where the white people live, and stands from the northern end where the black people lived. So it's an annoying photo that way. But here's Oak Lawn, and you can see that Oak Lawn has some tree lines in it. And then it's like there's a lot of dotting over here. And now, knowing what I know now, I'm interpreting that area to be a low-lying area with streams in it, because we hit at least one stream, and we did finally get enough map coverage to learn that there were two streams that ran through the cemetery, one to the north, and they met at a Y within the cemetery. And so that of course tells you, oh, why would you put your potter's field in the nice part of the cemetery? No, you put it in the annoyingly shallow part where if you dig, you're standing in water. Not that it's a good form to bury bodies in water, because then they bloat and pop up, just FYI. But the other issue with that low-lying area is, as we found out in October, is that the land is relatively shallow when it comes to burying people, and you have to dig into the ground rock. So what it looks like, the Sexton area, looks like at some point, without really, we think around the 1930s, so we have the 1930 burials, the headstones, so 1930s or 1940s. The city said, oh, let's make it a pleasing flatness. Maybe it had to do with the railroad being replaced by the interstate. I don't know, but because the railroad path is still here, but this is all now interstate. And but the area has a pleasing slope to it now. I mean, we just did not know that had happened. So we spent a lot of the Sexton dig trying to find maps and get an idea of where 1921 was, because clearly it was not, about 7 feet below the surface. I allowed that there would have been about a foot or so of ground formation from earthworm activity, just normal soil generation, but not, we dug about 6-7 feet before we got to a layer that we thought might have been the original ground layer. And that's a lot of overburden. So we left and came back, and based on the Public Oversight Committee's preference, we came back in October. So our second dig, the original 18 site. Now the original 18 area, we had some other I want to say more substantial hints, but I thought the Sexton narrative, oral history, was good. But what we did have was, we have two headstones. They're headstones, so they're buried, and you lay looking at the east in Oak Lawn. So the Eddie Lockhart is one of the decedents from the massacre, and so is Reuben Everett. Now, our ground penetrating radar data indicated that there's no burial here in front of Everett's headstone, but there's a disturbance here in front of Eddie Lockhart. So we're like, okay, well, there's a burial there, and then we have some other disturbances. So, but we also had this information. So this is slightly grainy, I'll read it. There were 13, this is from the Morning Tulsa Daily World, June 3rd, 1921. There were 13 other Negroes, 8 of whom were identified, buried in Potter's Field of Oak Lawn Cemetery yesterday. Those who were identified were Curly Walker, Henry Walker, Ed Adams, Joe Muller, George Lewis, Sam Reed, and Ed Howard. The 13 blacks were buried separately and in plain caskets. Some trouble was experienced in getting graves dug, but finally several Blacks volunteered for the work. Now I read that and I interpret some trouble as being, you must dig into ground rock, into the bedrock, I mean, in order to get enough depth to place a casket. But I'm sure there were other issues too, because remember, Blacks were in internment camps. It all been captured and put in internment camps if they were still living, and you had to find a white person to vouch for you to get out of the internment camp. And is that not one of those, I mean, somehow humiliating isn't the right word, I can't get it, but one of those stick in your craw moments when you've grown up your whole life being just you, and then suddenly you have to find a white person to vouch for you just so you can go see how much you have left of your house. And I mean, it's a whole other world. So you were an adult, now you're not an adult. It's like going home to your parents' house at the holidays. So here's a pretty, I've only verified some of these individuals. I mean, I read the Tribune and I read the Tulsa Daily World. The Tribune, I find, takes into account the fact that people die in hospital. So I'm liking its data a little better. You know, you get shot and abdominal wound, you don't die right away, you die a few days later. And the Tribune accounted for some of those. And the Tribune documented that some bodies were just found long past the point of identification, but were found and added to the list. So it gets my vote as far, I mean, at least if you're interested in some of the documented decedents count. But you notice that they're unidentified and identified. Now, if you go with the Tulsa Daily World account, they tell you that 5 more Blacks were buried in Oak Lawn, just Oak Lawn. Doesn't say Pottersfield, just says Oak Lawn. So we don't know if they'll be with this set or not. And one of the other interesting, well, I'll leave that because we'll be here all night. So here's our anomaly map. This is the gradiometer. And so remember, I'm not a geologist, but I've studied a little bit because I was trying to figure out where the people were based on this map. You know, where our decedents were and why. Well, see, so I've written all over this. We have, the collective we kept writing on it. So like our Eddie Lockhart's grave was our he has a headstone. We thought there's a grave there, but it turns out that smudge isn't him because his grave is about right there, not right there. And so we said, oh, this is anomaly 12 because this is approximately where his actual grave is. So we said, okay, what if each of these is a burial? Now, one of the things I learned is that this shape, I mean, this coloration, you see very black and very white, that's not a photocopier incidental, it's information. I did not realize it's information. So it's called a dipole, that there be black paired with white in the signal, and it usually indicates that there's a metallic something, as opposed to maybe some of these other signals. Like this one might have some metal, you know, see the whiteness, but this one, you know what's going on there. And same for this one, or I mean, is that the dipole? So we were having issues about orientation. Notice that there isn't really a line. There's a suggestion of a bit of a line here. And knowing what I know now, I would go, oh, there's a line right there. But we were having trouble making burial rows out of this signal map because the Oak Lawn is an organized cemetery. I mean, clearly, after digging up the Sexton area and seeing that there are no bodies there, I'm more impressed by the level of organization than ever. Well, Betsy Warner, Dick Warner's daughter, who's been carrying on some of the historical work, she had noted that the bodies were buried in rows, in temporal rows in the Potter's Field. So Eddie Lockhart's headstone defines the 1921 row. So the temporal row would be something like, sorry, north-south running, because remember you need to be able to pop up and look east. So what we did was we had all our anomalies mapped. Sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we said, which one of these can we get to with the backhoe? And so anomaly 6 was the one we could drive up to through here without driving onto other anomalies. So this is our very nice aerial view of day one. And you see we're in a different location. Here's the corner of Oak Lawn. And you can see this is 11th Street, Route 66. And so we aren't attracting too many reporters yet, but we're still going with our transparency model. And I was thinking, oh, we won't have to dig very much before we hit a burial. So I put out a tarp, and usually I do that when I want to be able to backfill rapidly. And I said, okay, aim for the tarp. But one of the other nice things about aiming for the tarp, we were still using the backhoe, and I wanted to define well, you have to define the backfill area. Oklahoma has a law, well, or Tulsa, I don't know, I think it's Oklahoma State Code. You can't put backfill too close to existing burial marked by the headstone. And so putting a tarp out gave us a nice target to judge our backfill extent. So we started digging. So this is actually day two. So day one started after lunch. It started at about 1 that we did groundbreaking. And we didn't find anything interesting, or we didn't think we had. So this is one of those instances where you go, oh, what you learned in July informed or polluted what you learned in October. And I say polluted because we did hit at about 3 feet down, we hit a temporary grave marker. And it was the rectangular plaque, and it was rusted. And I don't know if you know, temporary grave markers are temporary, but it was just the head of one. And the stem, because it's a rectangle with a stem, the stem was in place upright. Now we had just all been together. This is this 18 crew was the sexton crew minus one city worker. It was the exact same set of people. And so we look at that temporary grave marker and we go, oh, Phil. And it didn't matter that it was upright. We all just looked at it and said, Phil, why won't it come out? And so that was the end of the first day. Then we came back the next morning, took a few more scoops, and out in the backfill, we got this. So, you know, that's a nice plate for a coffin. It says at rest if you can't make it out. And we're like, wait a minute, we hit somebody's coffin. And sure enough, we found human remains in the backfill. So anomaly 6 is a burial. So I go, ooh, this is a nice, I mean, it says at rest. And while it was a temporary grave marker that for some reason was buried 3 feet below the surface, this had been a whole casket. We kept excavating. We found the rest of the coffins. We didn't, you know, exhume the woman, but we found enough of her to go, we got the top of your casket, and we found some of the hinges eventually excavating within the unit. And we found the wire leads that, you know, create tension across the lid of the coffin, you know, the curved lid. We found the wires, the ends of the wires, and the lid itself didn't survive our attention, but it was a wooden casket. We got wood, and we got enough of her to go, yeah, she's a woman. Should we have women? And so, because we're looking for a riot dead. And even though my view had adjusted in the 20 years where I wasn't thinking dead meant Black people, I do know that the population of riot dead, you know, who ends up dead in a riot? They're a population. Who's in that population? Mostly men. And men, and then teenagers, possibly, especially in this time period, but still male. And then women will be a lesser population. I mean, they'll just be much less represented in the population of people who end up dead in a riot. You know, it's a group, it's a class. So, because it's like wars, so people who end up dead in wars. So we started hand sifting and trying to find information about who was in this burial. And so here are a couple of my students. I brought one student. This is actually a student I borrowed from my colleague, Heather Walsh-Haney. I had her bring a student, and we had the student stand there with the tarps to shield the view until the city workers to get the fencing up so we could keep, protect the entrance of whoever the decedent is there, because we needed to figure out, we needed to see enough of her skeleton. More on that later. So anomaly 6 was going to take a while because the soil was probably at best decomposing bedrock that had been dug up once and then put back, and it had compacted so nicely that digging with a trowel was like, scrape, and you come back an hour later and you've only gone down an inch. I mean, we were seriously not making headway on exposing. We wanted the head in because we wanted to see, confirm suspicions about her sex and see if it was still really this nice coffin. So, because our narrative had plain boxes and maybe not even boxes if they were buried in wicker. And so we didn't, we were investigating. So while I was digging on anomaly 6, I was going back and forth, and I asked my colleagues, hey, Lee Bement and Deb Green, the geologist, hey, can you guys run the backhoe further along through anomalies 7, 8, 12, and 13? They're the next ones. You guys keep on with that, and I'll try and finish up anomaly 6 and see if she's in our sample. So they started a combination of backhoe work and core sampling. So Lee and Deb, again, get your own geologists. They are great. So what they did was I said, hey, Lee, can you sample this area west of Eddie Lockhart's burial, because I feel like the ground is a little compressed. You walk in that direction and there's a little bit of a depression and you walk out of it. And by a little bit, I mean like probably, it's not a little depression, but it's like a bowl kind of area, subtle, but a depression. I said, hey, let's go old school, because we're seeing these anomalies, and we know the dipole now was a temporary grave marker, but we're looking for unmarked graves. So can you sample in the direction of off our anomaly map? Because our anomaly map is off. I mean, we don't have information for part of the cemetery because it didn't produce anomalies. There were no anomalies, so we didn't bring that part of the map. And I said, well, can you sample in that direction? And Lee's looking at me like he'd already had that thought, and he and Deb start core sampling, heading west from 7, 8, 12, and 13, and then north of it. And we didn't do one south, didn't do enough of them south. Well, we only did a few south one because we actually had anomalies mapped out to south of there. So what happens? So between the core sampling said, hey, we're seeing a particular layer of soils where we're sure some of it's the burial, like you're seeing in 6. I'm like, oh, okay. And then they start backhoeing. I'm still in 6. And what do they hit? Another coffin. So we're going, okay, this is probably 7. So I know it looks like dirt, but if you look here, this green is another plate. And we're like, oh, there's a plate right here. So they carefully, scraped around, didn't disturb it. There's one somewhere near here where Deb is standing. She's not on it, but there's just barely enough space to go, oh, okay, 12 is over there. And so those anomalies were coffin burials. But before they could get to the end of 7, they hit another one, coffin. So it just turned out to be coffins until you got to, well, not all the way west, but here's a trench view. So we kept hitting coffins. And so these were like textbook burials. So while the ground was still moist enough for the light to be in our favor, you could see color changes and outlines of, here's a rectangle right here. And we're finding, we took the metal detector and said the rectangle has nails in it. And every now and then we found a few human remains, but the backhoe operators are great. So we barely, maybe only in 2 circumstances in that whole trench, actually. No, that was one burial. So one burial we got close to, and we found the teeth and an arm bone, part of an arm bone. And so they're still there because we didn't disturb anything else there. And then further in the trench, we found some cranial bones. And they're robust cranial bones. It's mainly the back of the head and side, occipital and parietal, but very robust. And so I'm thinking, yeah, that was a help that they were very male, but you go, well, guys die, so that doesn't mean anything. But when you look at the coffins, the layout of coffins, as once you get past number 7, once you get west of anomaly 7, the distance between coffins starts to be this far from head to toe. So literally an inch of backfill between them. The amount of space from north to south gets tighter. And some of we suspect there's coffins stacked on top of each other because we had to go higher with the backhoe to avoid damaging some of the coffins. And that's here. You can see part of it here. There's this stepped area here is, and these each are numbered for burials, not anomalies at this point. And it goes to 12 because we kept anomaly 6 as the first burial and counted to 12. And as far as we know, anomaly 6 may be in this trench because we didn't get to sample all of the way east with our coring. We only know this boundary. So this boundary is very close to the actual mass grave boundary. Some parts of it are the boundary, and some parts there's a coffin sticking, you know, like the coffin is still under there, like here with number 7 is. And then here, we don't know the boundary at all except through core samplings. And so if you see this sequence of soil here, that's ground formation, and then a color change. There's another color change further down. We can't really see it because Lee's standing in it. But that pattern continues for about 2 more trench widths to the north. And then it changes into undisturbed soil. So this trench we think goes here past Dr. Walsh-Haney, Heather Walsh-Haney, my classmate, and goes to about here in real distance. And so I think there's enough space in there for, 30 or 40 people. And they had to stack them. But we still don't quite.
Phoebe?
Yes.
We're going on almost 2 hours.
Oh, I am so sorry.
No, we have a very loyal following. I mean, people are not dropping off.
I will suddenly finish.
Okay, because they do have some questions, and I really want you to answer the questions. They're good questions.
No, I can be here for questions, but I do apologize, you guys. I was in full narrative.
No, you're fine. This is great stuff. Me, I could eat this all night. I mean, this is me, but yes, that's great. Keep.
I don't think there's very many left though. So those of you who are on tank 2, you have a respite coming soon.
Okay.
So I say that now. Here's what the preservation is like. Just not great, but at least teeth are intact. But we fully expect that the typically poorly preserved bones like vertebrae and ribs won't preserve well. So, because this is what we're seeing. So this is how the preservation looks. This actually isn't a bad diagram when I consider it. But you think coffin and person buried in it, and you go, oh, it's going to be a coffin, and then compress it to like a half or 2/3 of its height, and you got it. But even with anomaly 6, we saw the curvature of her skull. It was still there. And so we do have some hope that there'll be enough intact to do the next thing. So what's the next thing? So this is a these remains aren't associated with Race Massacre. These are teaching remains, but this is a good example of burned remains that are not high temperature burn, low temperature. So there's blackening, and I mean, granted, there's some calcination, but this is relatively low temperature because you can see large pieces and identifiable fragments, like this mandible. There's a part of a mandible here. There's part of there's a metatarsal there, probably some bit of fibula or radius there, some long bone. So these fragments, here's some of his maxilla too. But anyway, these fragments resulted in a reconstruction of this. So you go, oh, well, if you get enough pieces and have enough time, and if they're stable, potentially there can be a reconstruction of an interesting part like a cranium. So I haven't given up hope, but the preservation is not great. Our next step on the analysis is to hand excavate like we were doing with anomaly 6, employ more mobile radiography in a way that we hope we can find any internal bullets in place, because the bone preservation may not let us demonstrate gunshot wounds. Because if we have to reconstruct, and if they're to the torso, and some individuals were shot in the stomach, abdomen, then we may not even get gunshot wounds. It may be all flat, soft tissue without that bullet. I will take a skeletal inventory, and we're going to argue about the amount of imaging because photography is the minimum. Photography and radiography is the minimum, but we like to do 3D scanning. So, but now that we have human remains, we're going to talk about this with the Public Oversight Committee because 3D scanning allows for more reconstruction, but that's a level of data that the Public Oversight Committee should consider how they want to use that data. Biological reference samples, we'll try and save some of those because the teeth are preserving excellently. And then if there are any artifacts, we'll put them back with the remains. We haven't had artifacts yet except coffin hardware. I'll be looking for features of sex. If we just get this part of this is one part of a pelvic girdle. If I just get that part, I can identify sex. I just had that happen in a very high temperature burn here in Florida. And yeah, if it's intact, we can get sex. Ancestry, not so sure. Your cranium is interested in your ancestry in the same way that you resemble your cousins and aunts and uncles. But we have to get enough of it and be able to reconstruct it. And I put a very black male here and a very white male there, but they're not squashed flat. And the ones we work with will be squashed flat. The big question is, especially with teeth preserving well, can we do DNA analysis? I mean, effectively, we might be able to do it. You know, we might have a company that wants to, but keep in mind, we haven't had the discussion as a public entity. You know, the city of Tulsa has not discussed with itself how it wants to use any data from DNA analysis. We say it's from identification, but we'll only get cousins. We would be very lucky if we found someone, because these people are right here in relative to us in time. You know, 100 years ago, if they were having offspring, they're like great grandparents in focus. And to find someone that had left offspring, we might, if they're in a database, and if they're in a database. But what if they're not in a database? A lot of Black people aren't in databases, aren't in the public databases. You could say, hey, get your DNA in a database, and that's fine. I'm in a database, but I need people to be aware that sometimes you find out things you don't want to know, or you contributed to the ability to have your criminal relatives convicted, plus, but maybe you didn't want them convicted, minus. So, and what's going to happen with the profiles from these individuals? Will they go to academic purposes? You know, but I'm not a geneticist. Or will I be a co-author on multiple genetics papers while the rest of the city of Tulsa is not on it? You know, even though this investigation is about the people of Tulsa. Yeah, I wonder about that. So, but we need to talk about it because it's fine to have that happen if the city of Tulsa says, yeah, we don't mind, then we're good. So we still have to consider the other locations, their likelihood to produce remains, because we're probably going to find a few people there in Oklahoma, you know, 30 or 40. And remember, that doesn't even count people who died incidentally at the time and were fortunate to be buried as paupers in that same field, because it is the potter's field. So if you look up I gave the link, it's not live, but if you look up the Rodney King riot, or they don't call it that, but it had 63 deaths if you count the proximal ones, the ones that were directly due to violence, not the ones from people dying later in the hospital, because the city of Los Angeles claims like 1,000 in that context. So, but not very many women is the point I'm trying to make, not very many women. But the Canes and New Block Park, whether they're one or separate, and they could be separate, you know, these aren't funeral home deaths, is still higher on our list. And then Rolling Oaks, Booker T, we'll see what happens in the land of post-COVID. So I apologize for talking on, and I'm available to answer any of your questions, and you can always email me if you have to run. Thank you.
Well, the good news, Phoebe, is I think everybody now realizes the tremendous depth of the work that you and Scott and others of your team have been involved in just to get to this far. Yes. I mean, this isn't a walk in the park. Most people outside of those of us who are engaged in this do not understand just how difficult it all is to get to this point. Well, now they know. That's the good news. They know. And there are some good questions. Yeah, there are some great questions. I would love to talk to you about this for nothing but a week. You know, I would sleep in the office. We'd talk, we'd wake up, we'd sleep, so, you know, talk some more, eat food, this would be great. But unfortunately, we can't do that tonight. But we have some really good questions. I'm going to give you a break just for a second, but just for a second. Don't go anywhere. I have a couple things for Scott that have been asked. So, Scott, if you could unmute for a second.
I'm unmuted.
Good. Well, there are a couple of them. The easy one I'm going to give you first, which is there are a lot of people asking where they can get your books. So give them an outlet.
Well,
where can they get your books?
Luckily, Amazon is a good place. Barnes and Noble, your independent bookstore. They're all, my wonderful publishers, and so you can check then. I also have a new book. This is not a plug. I'm really just trying to be informational. So I'll have a new book coming out in May called The Groundbreaking: An American City and Its Search for Justice, and it is going to tell briefly the story of the massacre, but more importantly, tell how it was covered up and then uncovered, leading all the way to the efforts that we're involved with now.
Well, that's perfect, because that leads into one of the next questions. And this is something that Phoebe touched on as well. And I really appreciate it because it's near and dear to my heart, because this is not a one-off. This is a situation that occurred basically Reconstruction on. I mean, so you got Rosewood, you've got, the Phoenix Massacre, you've got stuff in Illinois, you've got things all over the place. This is probably the worst, the most egregious, but it wasn't a one-off. So both of you touched on this, and that's the question of cover up. This isn't the type of thing that could be easily covered up. I mean, city blocks disappeared. People were displaced in droves, okay? How did that manage to really work? What are the nuts and bolts of covering up basically what amounts to almost an ethnocide, if not a genocide?
Well, there's a couple things that are going on in here. And I mentioned the fact that the daily newspapers wouldn't talk about it for 50 years, to the point in the 1930s and the 40s, they had an op-ed column in one of the papers saying, what happened in Tulsa 15 years ago or 20 years ago? And when they got to what we then called the riot, they didn't mention anything. They just found other stories somehow to do it. The other thing is, it's important. Remember, Tulsa was a city awash in money. Okay, so the community is destroyed, but there wasn't a bank in Greenwood in 1921. So the more prosperous merchants would have had money in the white banks downtown. And what's amazing is how quickly it rebuilt. Now, there were some things like churches that took a long time, but you had, the same or better versions of brick commercial buildings that were built by the end of 1922, by 1923. Greenwood, ironically, you talk to old timers, they said in the late 30s and early 40s, it was even bigger than before. So the people, despite having lost everything, they didn't lose their jobs. So African Americans went back to work in the white community, had steady jobs, had decent pay, brought it back again. The other thing is, and this is a little hard to understand, although if you think of Holocaust survivors, this can help. It was also something in lots of parts of the Black community, African American community, where survivors didn't talk about it either. They didn't want to burden their children and grandchildren with this horror that they had been through. This was something they wanted to put in the past. So you even had, Black Tulsans who were the daughters and granddaughters of survivors that didn't find out about it until the 1980s and 1990s. So, it was something that, but again, it was something that was not taught. People who tried to bring it up had certain threats. And there were people who were fearful as well. As late as 1971, there was a Black gentleman in Tulsa, riot survivor, who kept a loaded rifle by his door, just in case it happened again.
I can understand that. And Phoebe, I really appreciate the fact of the family connection, as it turns out, to the area. And you're, again, I understand from my background, because I'm first generation here. I understand some of the issues of scars and not being able to discuss to the full extent. Very difficult working area, Phoebe. I mean, you're talking fill, you're talking re-landscaped on top of, you know, it's one thing to take the memory and remove it. It's a whole nother thing to take the landscape of the memory and alter it beyond practically all recognition. Holy cow. 10 feet deep, 3 meters deep. You're talking OSHA at that point. So
we had to
I mean,
back out of the trench because there was a collapse problem.
yeah. Oh, yeah. You have to have somebody ready to pull you out. I've been there, done that. It's no fun. So, I mean, what were you putting in? 12-hour days? I mean, this is old school. I mean, you've got the geophysics, which I do a lot, and the problems of the geophysics not going deep enough. So you're doing it old school. It's on hands and knees. It's trowel. It's brush.
Yeah.
How many hours per day were you able to put into this?
Well, we'll go back in the summer because of that, because we are like burning up daylight. So in October, we were dawn till dusk, and we were only out there dawn to dusk like 2 of the days. It was really the temperature, cold weather that did us in, because when it was 50 with wind chill making it 40 or 30, we could not work our hands or take notes, and I still had trouble reading what I wrote the first day because it was very cold. So and even down in I was hoping in the trench would be better, but then the weather warmed up, so it didn't matter. But no, it's the regular, I call them the regular hours. So we pretend to end at end of business because the construction crew, the city crew, they go home at 5:30. So once they left, we would start cleaning up. And so I was rarely, even in July, on site past like 6:37. Certainly I left there before dark each day, but in the summer it's easy to do that. But we have enough. We have enough communication amongst ourselves that we're able to, switch out. I think the biggest hindrance on this investigation, this process, is that by being in charge, I keep getting called out of the pit when I'm fully in the mode of, I'm about to find the end of, fill in blank, and someone saying, hey, can you come look at what's going on in Trench B? And I'm like, and we had, and we'll probably try this again because it actually did work for us. We had 3 operations going at once just in the original 18 because we were excavating, because I was working on Anomaly 6. We were core sampling both around what turned out to be the mass grave and previously had been core sampling Clyde Eddy, but that had folded up pretty quickly as far as getting to the interpretation phase. So the core sampling was going on while the backhoe was operating on anomalies 6, 7, 8, 12, and 13. So between those 3, I would go down 6, get back up, check the core, go walk around the trench, admire the nice plate, get back in 6, and get back up and look at the next core. And so we were doing a division that on the next. Well, because we're still interested in Clyde Eddy, because I want to say in the next attempt, we'll just stick with the mass grave and concentrate our focus and note-taking on that. But we need to resolve what anomaly might exist in the Clyde Eddy area, because it is of direct interest to the Public Oversight Committee. We've had that request.
That makes great sense. Now, for both of you, there's a question that both of you need to answer. And it's one that I think haunts all of us and is a question for all of us and has been raised by several people. The first time through, you got sort of support and then it got pulled, which happens. And it happens a lot, and people need to know it happens. And there's nothing you can do about it. The second time, it seems like you've gotten a great deal of actual support that it seems to be continuing through, and that's just terrific. The end point of this isn't simply for the descendants who need to have an endpoint, the people who were victimized here. It was a race massacre. It was not a riot. But it also needs to go beyond that.
Yes.
So I guess the question is, what are your plans, both of you? What are your plans to take this information and get it into the books? Because we all know that there's a lot of stuff out there that does not make it into the standard history books that really need to have more than a single statement or a quick line. So I'm going to leave that to you too. How are you going to take this information, that next step out, so that other people can embrace it, not simply in Oklahoma, but elsewhere? And then I have one last question and we'll be done.
I'm thinking this is going to be a multimedia approach, because between, because I will write my typical sterile report, and then I hope to follow that up with a more comprehensive, I still call it a report, but I'm trying to match the identities of the known Black Tulsans and even some of the white ones, their histories with that ends at this event. Who were they? Like I found one of the white victims because he got an obituary, but a lot of the white ones got packaged and sent home. And I said, oh, there's a whole narrative of you being sent home to family. Do they still exist? Who are they now? Does anyone want to know, that you're part of this event? And I get that story may end up being mostly a white story, because I can see that how a lot of Black stories don't go into print, but to have the connection between their news and their end and the details of their end, I'd like to put all that together.
Okay.
I know we talk about other forms of media. We, the physical, all of us, we're in a team together talking about which documentary
Sure.
has contacted us and who's interested. But
Well, that's
I don't want to wait for the novels and books in one sense, because I see this story having a direct impact on a certain act that's still pending, the Dyer Act, that was written in 1918, which I did not know about. And here we go investigating a lynch, the long-term lynching, this mob activity that the Dyer Act still hasn't been, lynching is not a federal crime still. And I'm like, well, can we bring attention to that irony? Because it's mentioned repeatedly in one of the newspaper accounts, I think the Tribune this time, mentions that there's going to be rapid action on 2 race law acts. One, the Dyer Act, and I forget the other one. And the Dyer Act was not passed, despite the Tulsa Race Massacre. So maybe we can get it right the second time.
Well, there's always the opportunity to get things right. That's the fun thing about being in the future and not totally in the past. Mm-hmm. So there are the last 2 questions. One of them is one that people do ask, which was, this is often purported to be one of the first times that U.S. citizens bombed by the air other U.S. citizens with the turpentine balls or shot or whatever actually occurred. One of the people asked, perhaps you have an answer for this, Scott, were the planes government, private? What do we know about the planes?
We know a little bit, and I'd also encourage people, if you just search up Tulsa Race Riot Commission report that we did back in 2000, 2001, it's quite lengthy. It was chosen by the American Library Association as one of the most significant government reports of the year. There's a chapter on the planes. These were private planes. There weren't many. We almost know how many were in town at the time. Most of them were, canvas covered, open cockpit, 1 or 2, people in them. I think there's been a lot of speculation as to what's going on. It is reasonable to assume that in at least one case, someone was able to light a stick of dynamite and drop it, or sticks of dynamite from a plane. But you're in this very flammable plane. The idea that people have Molotov cocktails they're lighting while you're going at 80 miles an hour, whatnot, is ludicrous. But I think that's true. But I think it's important to remember that Greenwood was destroyed on the ground. And this is such an outrageous act that it's been really kind of blown out of proportion. There was around the same time, however, I can't remember the town, but in West Virginia, there was a miners' strike, and there was a community that there was some bombing as well.
Yes, that was the United Mine Workers, et cetera. Yeah, that was the other one. Good. Okay, so this is again for both of you, and this is the last question, I promise. And that is, we're talking Oklahoma. So you have Oklahoma has an indigenous population. It also has a large indigenous population that was forcibly, in many instances, moved to Oklahoma. It was Indian territory.
Yeah.
When we talk about the situation that occurred, in this area in Tulsa, are we talking a population that was only Black? Are we talking a population that included indigenous people as well? Could there have been other people of color who were part and parcel of this? What's the reality of what we're expecting to see on the ground? And of course, how does that impact then your work, Phoebe, and of course your work as a historian, Scott? Now, this is the last question.
No, you're fine. I mean, ancestry is an element that I'm looking for in the remains, because even though they'll be fragmentary, I have hope that there might be enough. We need this part really to estimate ancestry from cranial remains, and I'm hoping there'll be enough. I mean, we might get some dental information that we can work with. The teeth are preserving well, but you need a set of teeth and not isolated teeth. And so the documentation that we have for the Oak Lawn area doesn't suggest that there's a truly diverse population in this riot sample. But that's because we're dealing with a mortuary listing, and that does not at all address what might be faced if there was a National Guard burial, if there were multiple National Guard burials. And because we are talking about people who were, fleeing. Mary Parrish's account of people fleeing on foot and being shot at, that could happen to anyone. If the same kind of preservation occurs in all places, we would have a population rich in African Americans and lower in people of other populations in the context of this riot. But I don't decide that already that they'll all be, at least not in this era where I'm now aware that they're white deaths, compared to 1998 when I'm like, oh yeah, they'll all be Black. Yeah, how do I know that? Because, some of the bodies were burned on top of that, and if we go for DNA analysis, we may learn something we didn't expect, but if the preservation allows. But I would just say that there's the proportions are weighted towards African Americans, but until you learn otherwise, you don't exclude all populations, because why should you?
I'll jump in, but I'm going to actually go back to the previous question. Our goal, our ultimate goal is to, for the majority of the Black victims of the massacre, they were buried while their loved ones were being held under armed guard. They were not allowed to attend the funerals. They were, I feel as if they were thrown away, maybe less brusquely than others. I think it is our duty as a community, but as a nation, is to welcome these people back, to see if we could find out who they are, rebury them with honor. And I fully suspect that we will have a significant memorial at some point to do this, and think Tomb of the Unknown Soldier or whatever it might be. But that will become a national shrine in my book. That will be a place that people will want to go and to pay homage, not simply to these people, but to the thousands and thousands and thousands of other victims of racial violence in America. We just hopefully, knock on wood, are going to be able to recover the remains of the ones in Tulsa and rebury them and memorialize them appropriately.
Okay, that's great.
What he said, and doubly so, because remember who these people are, especially our Oak Lawn individuals. They were heroes. These were people that had been to war and come back and were being told that you have to submit to lynching. You had to submit to white law when you were your own human. You have been and have died for this country or bled for this country, and now, nope, you're not your own human. You're beneath these white ones, not as good, and you can't take up arms without being made the villain to protect your own property, not to go on to someone else's property, but to protect your own or to protect the laws that govern you, the same laws. Nope, you're the villain. And these individuals, any others we find associated with them, victims of violence in the context of that temporal period and this burial, they're the heroes.
Okay, so this is going to pretty much conclude our presentation this evening. I would like to thank both of you, Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield and Dr. Scott Ellsworth, for your commitment to this very important project and for sharing your knowledge with us all. I mean, kudos to you, commendation. It's terrific. I'm really looking forward, I know you are, to an endpoint where we actually have this thing, in hand to the extent that we can.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also like to make sure that we thank Ann Passer, Chair of the Programs and Lectures Committee, Dina Weibel and Kevin Murphy again for their dedication to our work that made this series and so many of the others possible through the Explorers Club. I'd like to point out the Explorers Club has some 30 chapters in the United States and around the world. It is characterized by a great diversity of its members' background and interests. In point of fact, we have a diversity committee that ensures this, which is chaired by J.R. Harris. The 7 founding members included 2 polar explorers, the curator of birds and mammals at the American Museum of Natural History, an archaeologist, a war correspondent who was also an author, a professor of physics and ethnologist. Today, the membership includes field scientists and explorers from over 60 countries, whose disciplines include aeronautics, anthropology, archaeology, astronomy, biology, ecology, entomology, mountaineering, marine biology, oceanography, paleontology, physics, again, polar exploration, and zoology. So basically A to Z. Join us for 2 upcoming events, please, if you're interested. The first is this Thursday, November 11th at 6 p.m. It's our popular Chapter Connect program, and this time we'll be featuring the Pacific Northwest chapter with their chapter chair, John All. Now, next Monday, the Monday night lectures continue, just as it did today, which is the 16th. The Explorer Club will be presenting Exploration Beyond Borders, Humboldt and his ties to France with the guest speaker, the Humboldt expert, Dr. Sandra Reebach. And in both instances, these will be taking place not at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, but 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So the one on Thursday and the one on Monday, 6 p.m. Thursday time. And just as it was this time, if you wish to watch it live as a streamed event, simply visit our homepage at explorers.org or on our Facebook page. So stay curious, be safe, explore your world. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.